Golden Age stars with the worst hair transplants. Imagine this. Some of the most dashing and admired Hollywood stars were walking around with hair that looked like it came from a toy doll's head. These were the early days of hair transplants, a time when the methods used were so undeveloped that the results often looked worse than the baldness they were meant to fix. These old-school celebrities were pioneers in the cosmetic world, stepping into uncharted territory in hopes of maintaining their youthful appearance. Sadly, instead of picture-perfect results, many ended up with shocking, patchy, and unnatural-looking hair. They weren't just trendsetters. They were test subjects in what would later be known as some of the worst examples of cosmetic surgery in history. But before we get into the details of these jaw-dropping hair nightmares, leave a comment below letting us know where you're tuning in from. One lucky viewer will win a rare DVD box set featuring 25 classic films starring the actors we're about to uncover. Now, let's take a deep dive into some of Hollywood's most embarrassing hair transplant tales. Number 10. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the Bad Hair Board. Frank Sinatra was one of the first big-name celebrities to undergo hair transplant surgery back in the 1960s. Unfortunately, the results were anything but subtle. Using an early technique called plug transplantation, surgeons removed small round patches of hair-bearing scalp from the back of his head and reimplanted them on his bald spots. The result? It looked like a checkerboard of tiny doll hairs poking out of his scalp. The plugs didn't match his natural hair texture, and the placement created an odd, patchy look. Photographers had to use flattering angles and lighting to hide the embarrassing result. Sinatra relied heavily on pomade and styling tricks to disguise the transplanted plugs. In one unforgettable moment during a 1965 TV special, hot studio lights caused Sinatra to sweat heavily. His hairstyle separated under the moisture, exposing the plug pattern beneath. Makeup artists had to scramble during commercial breaks to cover it up with hairspray and powder. Sinatra's dedication to keeping up appearances was understandable given his iconic status, but it also highlighted the pressures celebrities faced during that time. With no social media to control their image, any unflattering photo or moment on television could turn into a public relations nightmare. That made these visible hair issues even more damaging. Number 9. Burt Reynolds, the bandit's hair fiasco. Though Burt Reynolds rose to fame after the traditional golden age, his hair transplant issues began early and became legendary. In the 1970s, Reynolds opted for multiple surgeries to restore his receding hairline, but the end result was less than natural. His new hairline was unnaturally low and straight, giving his face an odd frame that looked more like a helmet than real hair. The density of the transplants varied, with thick patches placed next to sparse ones. Reynolds himself later admitted that getting the transplant was a mistake. Despite undergoing additional surgeries to fix the first botched attempt, none could undo the damage. He was left with extensive scarring and weakened follicles, making future hair restoration efforts even harder. Ironically, Reynolds' rugged features made him handsome even without hair, but the surgery undermined his natural charm. Reynolds' case became a sort of cautionary tale in Hollywood, whispered about behind closed doors and discussed in industry magazines. His honesty in later years about his regrets helped others avoid the same mistakes, and he used his own story to advise younger actors to think twice. Number 8. Sammy Davis Jr., a Rat Pack hair regret. Sammy Davis Jr. opted for a hair transplant in the late 1960s, and sadly the outcome clashed with his unique personality and style. The transplant gave him a hairline that didn't match his face shape or age. It looked almost like a small toupee made from his own hair. The transplanted sections formed an overly dense patch at the front, clashing with the thin sides and back. To hide this, Davis styled his hair with elaborate pompadours and used thick hair products. But under harsh stage lighting, the plugs cast visible shadows, making the transplant lines all too clear. As time passed, Davis began using a combination of transplants, extensions, and strategic combing to create the illusion of fuller hair. Sadly, these efforts damaged his natural hair further, locking him into a cycle of concealment. For someone as energetic and flamboyant on stage as Davis, the hairline should have added to his stage persona, but instead, it became something he had to fight against. Reports even suggest that he would carry his own hairstylist on tour just to maintain appearances, showing how much effort went into keeping up the illusion. Number 7. William Shatner, the Captain's Hair Odyssey. William Shatner's transplant story began during the original Star Trek era in the late 60s. He tried the same plug transplant method, but the outcome was just as awkward. The transplants left him with unnaturally thick and straight rows of hair. His hairline didn't recede with age, which looked bizarre as the rest of his face aged normally. The density was so unnatural that his hair resembled a stiff brush more than a natural style. The inconsistency became a running joke, with fans and critics often commenting on how his hair defied time while the rest of him aged. The plugs were packed too tightly, giving a fake and overly dense look. Worse yet, the procedure left permanent scarring, meaning he couldn't shave his head even if he wanted to. He was forever stuck with that artificial look. Even as his roles evolved and he played older or more serious characters, the hair transplant remained a distracting element. Unlike many of his peers who transitioned to bald or gray looks gracefully, Shatner's maintained hairline often felt out of sync with his characters. Number 6. Tony Curtis. Some like it, transplanted. Tony Curtis had one of Hollywood's most extensive hair transplant histories, beginning in the 1960s and continuing into later decades. Unfortunately, each procedure made things worse. His plugs formed neat, unnatural rows across his head, resembling a cornfield rather than a scalp. Makeup crews had to work overtime on film sets to mask the obvious lines and awkward spacing. The worst part? His transplanted hair stayed thick and dark while his natural hair turned gray. This two-tone effect was glaring and impossible to hide without dyeing all his hair, which only made things look more unnatural. Curtis became obsessed, getting additional procedures every few years, hoping to fix the flaws. Instead, the cumulative surgeries left his scalp scarred and fragile. Curtis's struggle with aging in a youth-obsessed industry was well documented, and his hair transplant history was just one of many examples of how far stars would go to maintain their looks. At times, his appearance would become a distraction even to his co-stars, who had to adapt their makeup and styling to match his unusual look. Number 5. Mel Gibson, the Road Warrior's hair detour. Mel Gibson's hair transplant journey didn't begin until later in his career, but it echoed the mistakes of earlier stars. His straight, thick hairline looked out of place against his maturing face. The transplant created thick sections next to bald ones, a condition professionals call forest fire pattern. Gibson had to use specific hairstyles, angles, and lighting to mask these inconsistencies on camera. Ironically, his natural receding hairline gave him a more mature, seasoned look that matched his later roles. The transplant made him appear unnaturally youthful in contrast to his aging facial features. Directors often had to adjust shots or even rewrite scenes to avoid drawing attention to his odd hairline. He reportedly sought several consultations in the years that followed to correct the damage, but by then, the legacy of the original work had already impacted his image. Number 4. John Travolta, Saturday Night Hairline. John Travolta's hair woes began in the 1980s. As his iconic thick mane began to thin, he turned to early transplant techniques. The result was a hairline that looked like it had been drawn with a ruler. It was too symmetrical, too straight, too fake. The texture and direction of the transplanted hair didn't match his remaining natural strands, creating a stark contrast that was hard to overlook. This mismatch meant that Travolta couldn't style his hair the way he once did, with casual flair. The rise of HD cameras in the 1990s only made the problem worse, highlighting the lines and inconsistencies in his hairline. Travolta, like many others, became a frequent target for gossip magazines. His hairline was often zoomed in and analyzed in celebrity blogs and forums. Every red carpet appearance turned into a guessing game. Was it real or fake? His later move to fully embrace a bald look brought him renewed praise. Number 3. Elton John, Rocket Man's hair burnout. Elton John eventually became known for embracing wigs, but his early attempts at transplants in the 1970s were a total misfire. The plug method gave him sparse, uneven growth and clear geometric patterns. The hair didn't blend, didn't flow, and didn't look natural. The varying directions and densities made it impossible to style. He gave up on transplants entirely and began wearing elaborate wigs, which became a signature part of his flamboyant persona. Ironically, giving up on real hair gave him a new level of freedom and confidence that surgery never could. His wigs became so iconic that they were referenced in pop culture, music videos, and even merchandise. In many ways, the failure of his hair transplant helped him evolve his personal brand. Number 2. Sean Connery, Bond's hair mission failed. Sean Connery attempted early transplants in the 70s, but quickly realized it was a mistake. The procedures left him with odd patches and plug patterns that clashed with his masculine image. The transplanted hair was a different shade and texture, and the contrast was most apparent in close-ups. The turning point came when Connery accepted his baldness and shaved his head. That bold move made him even more iconic. Suddenly, bald was sexy, and Connery's confident embrace of his look changed Hollywood standards. His failure helped prove that masculinity and hair aren't mutually exclusive. Over the years, Connery's bald look became a symbol of strength and maturity. It redefined the public's perception of aging actors and influenced how future leading men presented themselves. Number 1. Marlon Brando, the godfather of hair regret. For years, Marlon Brando's transplant failures were kept under wraps. But behind the scenes, he underwent several surgeries that left him with scars and uneven growth. The plugs were placed too low and too straight, disrupting the natural shape of his hairline. The result was so bad that Brando resorted to wearing wigs for the rest of his career. The transplanted hair grew in odd directions, and some stylists described it as grass through concrete. Rather than embracing his natural look, Brando spent years hiding under hats and hairpieces, even though his roles later in life would have suited a balder appearance. His refusal to go public about the failed surgeries only added to the mystique, but behind the scenes, the effort to maintain his look reportedly caused stress, delays on set, and added work for everyone from stylists to cinematographers. Why the technology failed. The issue with all these transplants stemmed from poor surgical technology. The standard method of the time was known as punch grafting. This involved cutting out small, circular portions of hair-covered scalp and implanting them elsewhere. These plugs were far too large and gave the telltale doll hair effect. Hair doesn't grow in circles, and transplanting plugs without regard for hair direction, texture, or density made the outcomes extremely unnatural. Surgeons of the time often lacked aesthetic training. They approached it like a routine surgery, not an art form requiring balance and subtlety. The emotional fallout. We often forget the emotional toll these cosmetic procedures took. Stars became fixated on their hair, seeking revision after revision. Many developed anxiety, depression, and even body dysmorphic disorder. Constant styling, lighting adjustments, and camera positioning became part of daily life. The failed results made some stars more self-conscious than baldness ever did. Some actors became so concerned with being photographed from the wrong angle that they would cancel public appearances altogether. Others added clauses to their contracts requiring makeup artists and hairstylists to remain on set at all times. The rise of the cover-up industry. The poor outcomes of these procedures created a secondary industry. Experts were hired solely to cover up hair disasters. Stylists, makeup artists, photographers, and lighting pros. Movie studios invested in specialists who could hide scars, mask plug patterns, and make hair appear full and natural through clever tricks. Photographers learned to work around flaws using angles, shadows, and filters. Entire teams were dedicated to making actors look normal on screen. For many, this was a full-time job. Learning through mistakes. Despite the embarrassment and personal toll, these disasters served a purpose. They highlighted what not to do. Medical professionals began to understand that hair restoration was as much about art as it was about science. Surgeons refined their techniques, began offering more realistic expectations, and paid greater attention to aesthetics. Thanks to the public failures of early celebrity patients, modern transplants are now more natural-looking, less invasive, and tailored to individual needs. And that concludes our journey through Hollywood's most shocking hair transplant disasters. These famous figures helped pave the way for better procedures and served as cautionary tales for those seeking perfection. Sometimes, letting nature take its course is far more elegant than trying to force it back in time. Don't forget, subscribe to tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video, where we reveal more of Hollywood's best-kept secrets and biggest blunders.